Eugene Scott.
Thanks very much, George. I used to be the executive director of the National Center for Science Education, which monitors and provides information to defend the teaching of evolution and climate change in the public schools. I'm going to talk today about evolution, but a lot of the things I'm going to talk about may also be relevant to the teaching of climate change. Now, anti-evolutionists have affected the teaching of evolution for a long time through many avenues. Excuse me. I'm afraid that the cold that my husband and I have been passing around since Thanksgiving has come back to get me this afternoon. So all you people in the front row, I'll cough this direction instead. By the way, now that I'm on a digression, about the program, many of you looking at your program will not recognize me. I do want to assure you that I did not send them that picture. I take a certain amount of pride in having my headshots be no more than 5 years old. Somehow the one I sent them got lost, and that one's from the 1990s and exists someplace on the internet, goodness knows where. But this is what I really look like, folks. For good or for ill, this is what you got. My hair is no longer brown, okay. So one of the ways that anti-evolutionists have affected the teaching of evolution is through state science education standards. Most states have these documents, and these are guidelines that local districts use to develop their own standards and then their own curriculum. Now, the National Science Education Standards were developed in the early 1990s. They've been replaced by the Next Generation Science Standards, published in 2013. Because these documents were developed by scientists and educational leaders, they include evolution. And since they provided a template for many states to develop their own state standards, in the 1990s, evolution started appearing in state standards of many states where evolution had been scarce. There were a lot of evolution wars during the 1990s and 2000s, and frankly, even in the 2010s, as creationists and their allies pushed back against the inclusion of evolution in state standards and or the adoption of evolution in standards developed by local school districts. This chart, courtesy of the National Center for Science Education, shows states where there have been challenges to either evolution in red, climate change in blue, or both, purple, since the release of NGSS in 2013. Now, you'll have to go to NCSE to find out which states actually watered down the coverage of one or the other sciences. I don't really have time to go into them today. So state standards continue to be a battleground. Now, in addition to state standards, creationists have attempted to get creationism mandated through local or state policies and laws. Now, a little bit of basic civics here. You all remember the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights has a religion clause. There are two components of the religion clause. There's the Establishment Clause, which states that public governmental agencies cannot promote religion, and then there's the free exercise, which requires that local agencies and education is a function of local government. Government cannot inhibit religion. So the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause taken together mean that government must be religiously neutral, and the schools have to be religiously neutral. Courts have uniformly held that the presentation of religious idea like creationism or intelligent design violates this neutrality. Briefly, these various laws over the last almost 50 years have been trying to balance the teaching of evolution with something. First, they just tried to teach creationism, but this is clearly an unconstitutional advancement of religion. Next, creation science was invented, the claim that creationism could be made scientific, and clearly this was also struck down as unconstitutional promotion of religion. And finally, most recently, intelligent design, the most recent attempt to make creationism scientific, was also struck down by the courts. The demise of intelligent design as a strategy for getting creationism into the schools came about through a case involving a school board in Dover, Pennsylvania, that passed a local policy requiring the teaching of intelligent design. Kitzmiller versus Dover pretty much stopped efforts to get ID caught in science classrooms. The National Center for Science Education recorded excuse me, only a couple of efforts on the local or state level to try to mandate intelligent design after 2005. Go Kitzmiller. But that point didn't mean that creationism movement ground to a halt after 2005. Remember that traditional creationists, the young earth creationists, are a parallel movement alongside of intelligent design, and even if ID has faded, the traditional young earth creationists are going great guns. Answers in Genesis, the largest young earth creationist organization in the country, has the Creation Museum and the recently opened Ark Park. Actually, they call it the Ark Encounter, but the rhyme is too good to pass up. This was opened in July of 2016. The second largest and oldest and most respected young earth creationist organization, the Institute for Creation Research, is planning to build its new museum at its headquarters property in Dallas and have started already their capital campaign to raise money for it. And ICR and AIG are not alone. Creationist museums have mushroomed in many parts of the country. I literally could not fit them all on one slide. I left out the Northwest Science Museum in Boise for anybody who came here from Idaho. The young earth creationist movement has always been a lot larger than the intelligent design movement and continues strong today. So even if Kitzmiller threw sand in the gears of ID, anti-evolutionism continues to evolve. I'm going to stick with legislation for the time being. There have been more than 70, that's 70, anti-evolution bills produced in various states through the last decade or so since Kitzmiller. Although it would be expected that there's going to be some similarity across these bills, because in a state, a bill may be introduced or modified only slightly from one year to another, and sometimes a bill will copy a bill from another state. There's been a very interesting pattern to these 70 bills, which was very nicely illustrated by what I think is going to prove to be a very important scientific paper that came out in December of 2015, just about a year ago, by Nicholas Matsky. Matsky took a database of the texts of legislation submitted since 2004, which you can find on the NCSE website, and analyzed it much as you would analyze a group of fossils or DNA or some other sort of evolving system. He broke the text of the bills into phrases and traced how the phrases were repeated or not repeated, they might have gone extinct, through the temporal sequence of these bills, much as one would take morphological or biochemical characteristics of fossils or living species and trace relationships among them. And on this matrix, he applied some very standard phylogenetic tree construction techniques and was able to show ancestor and descendant relationships among these bills and also changes in strategy through time. He traces the evolution of these bills from 2004 to 2015. Time runs along the bottom from early to recent. At the left is 2004. At the right is 2015. The bills themselves are indicated at the ends of the branches. So this is a South Dakota bill from 2014. This is an Iowa bill from 2009. You kind of get how this tree works a little bit. The ancestor of all of these 70-plus bills is a group of bills originating in Alabama in 2004. These Alabama bills appeared from about 2004 until 2009, collectively called academic freedom bills. They promote the teaching of creationism in the guise of protecting a teacher's academic freedom to teach all the evidence, or the full range of scientific views. This latter phrase came from Senator Santorum's Senate amendment to the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act, which I will talk about in more detail later. Historically, these bills were a wink and a nudge to encourage teachers to teach creationism without mentioning the word, by teaching the full range of scientific views, which in the creationist viewpoint included intelligent design, or in some cases, even creation science. A policy originating in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana in 2006, that's the mode of the node at the dark smudge. Obviously, you're not memorizing these. This is too difficult to see from a distance. But, they're nice dark black lines. You can get an idea of what the tree looks like. This influenced a second major wave where, in addition to evolution and origin of life, global warming and cloning were added as topics that teachers should teach differently in the curriculum. These are the Louisiana Science Education Act and its descendants. Now, 2 of these have been passed. The Louisiana Science Education Act itself, and a clone of the LSEA that passed in Tennessee a couple of years later. The good news is, mostly through the hard work of NCSC and our allies in various states, all the rest of these bills died in committee or failed on the floor or in other ways were not passed. 2 of them is too many, but it could have been worse. As these bills were partly marketed as critical thinking bills, the phrase strengths and weaknesses of evolution or global warming or whatever, similar wording became very common. Now, there was, of course, overlap. The academic freedom wording didn't totally go away, and there were other aspects of the academic freedom bills that occasionally show up in science education acts, such as wording that attempts to protect teachers if they stray from the curriculum. But the full range of views encouraging the teaching of ID seemed to largely fade away in the mid-2000s. It's pretty safe to say that the victory over intelligent design in Kitzmiller versus Dover in 2005 had a large role to play in that, as the strategy of presenting more carefully disguised creationism, such as ID, failed, as had the strategy of presenting obvious creationism. This strategy was largely replaced by the strategy to teach the strengths and weaknesses of evolution. Now, to summarize in living color, because it's easier to see, Motzky's analysis of legislation suggests that topically, the recent evolution of anti-evolution legislation began in 2004 with a focus on evolution and the origin of life. That's the kind of sickly greenish yellow color there. What became known as academic freedom bills. A policy originating with Ouachita Parish, the Louisiana Science Education Acts beginning in 2006, influenced a second major wave where global warming and human cloning were added, and these have continued on in various ways, the red portion of the diagram here. Most recently, we're seeing a yet more subtle anti-evolutionary approach of being very unspecific about what topic teachers should single out for teaching the strengths and weaknesses, because quite frankly, it's only within historical perspective are these bills recognizable as anti-evolution bills. Now, notice that there have only been a couple of bills that have been, only a couple of bills since Kitzmiller that have specifically promoted intelligent design. That's the blue line in this chart. If Kitzmiller had gone the other way, if the judge had declared the teaching of intelligent design to be constitutional, I can pretty much guarantee you that this tree would have been blue all the way up. So even if anti-evolutionism legislation hasn't ground to a halt, at least the map of the legislation has been simplified. But there's a reason to believe that creationism currently has, in fact, a new lease on life in 2017, as the title of my talk suggests. What we've found at NCSE is that certain elections tend to energize creationists. Now, let me stop and make a very large caveat here, because I was talking with one of you earlier today. Anytime I talk to a reporter from outside of the country, whether it's Europe or Asia or any place, the very first thing I have to say is, well, you know, in the United States, we do not have a national curriculum. And they look at me like, what? This makes no sense at all to them. Local control of education is sacred in the United States. If you are a politician, attack local control of education at your peril. You will not survive the next election. Now, there are many ways that local control of education is kind of a neat thing, and you can do interesting and innovative stuff, but frankly, when it comes to curriculum, it's kind of hard to argue that this is a really great idea. You know, a fourth grader is a fourth grader. Do you teach long division in third grade or fourth grade? Why is this something that would vary from one part of a state to another? And why should you teach evolution in one part of the state and not teach it in another, or even within the same school district? There are close to 15,000, excuse me, that wasn't supposed to be animated. There are close to 15,000 independent school districts in the United States, each of which makes the most important decisions: who to hire, how much to pay them, what the school day looks like, lots and lots of regulations about what the district's curriculum is going to be. All of that is determined at the local level. There are often carrots and sticks involved to encourage a local district to adopt the state standards, which then will guide the local district's development of its curricula, which is actually what goes into the classroom. But, you know, the decision of what to teach really is left to the local district. And what actually gets taught is determined and monitored locally. There is nobody from the state level, trust me on this, who is coming down to look over the shoulder of Mrs. Brown and see what she's actually teaching when the school classroom door is closed. Local control is enshrined. What this means is that the federal government actually has very little control over curriculum. There are various ways that the federal government can affect a state and by trickle down a local school district. There's a lot of money that goes from the feds to the states, but it tends to be in block grants and for specific things like low socioeconomic or other deprived population. There's disability education. There's lots of programs out there. But when it comes to curriculum, that's something that really is locally determined. But the federal government can have an influence on what gets taught in your kid's classroom by setting a tone or an atmosphere that can be very influential. And occasionally, not often, but occasionally, the feds can enact policies that have far-reaching effect on the local level. Let me give you a case study. George W. Bush was elected to his first term as president in 2000. He had considerable support from conservative Christians who were elated at his election, even though he didn't actually pay off for them very much. His first signature bill, he wanted to be the education president, was the No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB, which teachers referred to as No Child Left Untested. And this was an education bill. As mentioned above, Senator Santorum, in proposing, when the bill came to the Senate to be considered, Senator Santorum proposed a sense of the Senate amendment to No Child Left Behind. That was included with No Child Left Behind when the Senate version and the House version went to the conference committee. Now, the amendment sounded very innocuous, and most senators saw nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It passed by very wide majorities. It was not innocuous. It actually affected evolution education for more than a decade. The first paragraph of the Santorum Amendment said, good science education should prepare students to distinguish the data or testable theories of science from philosophical or religious claims that are made in the name of science. Well, kind of sounds like a good idea. I don't object to that. But there was another paragraph. Where biological evolution is taught, the curriculum should help students to understand why the subject generates so much controversy and should prepare the students to be informed participants in public discussions regarding the subject. Not such a good idea. Why is evolution being singled out from all of the other controversial topics in the curriculum? This wasn't even directed specifically to you know, to science in a sense. Shouldn't students be informed participants in public discussions regarding many topics that generate controversy? Intelligent design proponent Philip Johnson wrote the amendment for Santorum and was quite upfront about it. The purpose of the sense of the Senate amendment was to encourage teachers to teach the evidence against evolution, to teach the weaknesses of evolution, to avoid the dogmatism of teaching evolution. And I don't need to remind this audience that evolution is taught dogmatically, in the same sense that thermodynamics and cell division are taught dogmatically, and as any other well-supported science. Now, as you know from having heard the song Just a Bill, the Senate bill and the House version of a bill go to a conference committee, and that is where we and our allies, many other science societies and science education societies, swung into action to try to kill this amendment, because this would be an exceptionally dangerous policy to be part of the bill. Because if it were part of the bill, then creationists all over the country could say, we're required to teach the evidence against evolution when we teach evolution. And it was not immediately apparent because, you know, it sounded this kind of a mushy thing about you know, students being able to discuss stuff. Yeah, everybody's for critical thinking. Raise your hand if you're against critical thinking, right? Of course, everybody's for critical thinking. But this is not critical thinking. This is straight up anti-evolutionism. And if you know anything about the history of the creationist movement, you know that they have this dualistic way of looking at the subject of creation and evolution. There's either evolution or creationism. Therefore, evidence against evolution is evidence for creationism. If you disprove evolution, you automatically prove creationism. And so disproving evolution was not a problem for them. They could still then work in the creationism. Now, politics is the art of the possible. Okay. We were not able to kill this bill, but we were able to defang it pretty well. There were too many senators who voted for it. There was too much support for doing something like this. At the time, Senator Santorum was, I think, the third or fourth most powerful Republican in the Senate. It wasn't going to be very easy to just, you know, put a little red line through his sense of the Senate amendment, voted for by such a large quantity of his colleagues. We did find allies in the conference committee co-chair, Senator Ted Kennedy, and we were able to make the amendment far less dangerous than its earliest inception. The final amendment, it wasn't even an amendment. The conference report had an item buried down, item number 47 or something like that. When the dust cleared, the Santorum amendment had been reduced to one paragraph with the only thing remaining of the original statement, the words in red that you see on the slide. It became a controversial issues amendment, not an anti-evolution amendment. Evolution was not singled out for special treatment. It was used only as a parenthetical, as an example of a controversial issue. Now, this may seem small, but politically it's huge. This was a huge victory for our side. No longer was this an anti-evolution point. First of all, it wasn't part of the bill, okay? It was a conference committee item, just a little bullet, a numbered paragraph in the conference committee. That was very important. And number two, it was not an anti-evolution bullet. It was a controversial issues bullet. We're all for teaching controversial issues. I've actually got a whole lot of ideas about that too, but that's not today's talk. What happened was now, granted, the creationists still made the claim that, no child left behind requires us to teach creationism or at least evidence against evolution in the classroom, but our allies at the local level could go and say, here's NCLB, where do you find the word evolution in it? The word evolution never occurs anywhere. It's in the conference committee report. So it basically really did defang the Santorum Amendment. But note the phrase, the full range of scientific views. Now, this phrase we saw appearing regularly in legislation throughout the 2000s. this Ohio legislation in 2002, the very next year, is a very good example of a bill that pulls wording directly from the Santorum Amendment. And we saw this over and over and over, all through the 2000s. So indeed, the actions of a federal administration can affect the teaching of evolution, even if our decentralized education system doesn't give them very much direct authority. But perhaps more importantly, after the election of President Bush and then the re-election of President Bush, there was a tenor or an atmosphere that can be set by the federal administration, which acts to encourage anti-evolutionary activity at the local level. And this was the case in the Bush decade as well. NCSE's records show that in the period following the 2000 election and 2004 re-election of George Bush, local creationist groups were energized, and the decade of the 2000s was a quite busy one for us. Looking at the period 2000 to 2003, there were 14 states that had introduced legislation against evolution or affecting the teaching of evolution, 14 states that had controversies at the state school board level, 35 states that had local controversies, in other words, local school board, individual schools, or individual teachers, and a total of 40 states in which there were controversies over the teaching of evolution. Now, do please realize that all of our data at NCSE are based on what we know about. Either people would call us, we would be asked to help advise, or we would see articles in the press about this. I don't believe for one moment that nothing was going on in North and South Dakota, for example. But the only data I have are the ones that I can demonstrate. The only data I am producing are the only ones that I can actually back up with actual evidence. I also found data in the NCSE archives from 2005 to 2007. 23 states introduced legislation, 11 states that had controversies at the state school board level, 34 states had local controversies, local school board, et cetera, and a total of 41 states in which there were controversies over the teaching of evolution. You're all saying, where's my state? I know you're doing that. The decade of the 1990s, the decade before this one, had far fewer flare-ups, as we refer to them in-house, although the data aren't directly comparable as I can do. And I didn't have time to dig it all out, and it's there. And although I don't have data to show you, the number of flare-ups in the following 8 years, from 2008 to 2016, were fewer. The bottom line is the creationists didn't go away after Bush left office, but they weren't as enthusiastic. There was no encouragement after 2008 from federal officials, as there had been with the Santorum Amendment, and much of the attention in science education post-2008 was focused on opposing climate change in standards. I think, though, given the recent election, that creationists indeed may have a new lease on life. One might become concerned about evolution education, if not science education entirely, as a result of these people who are likely to be confirmed cabinet members, and in the case of Mr. Pence, the person in the administration most responsible for domestic policy. Ms. DeVos, the probable Secretary of Education, comes from a conservative Christian background. She's Dutch Reformed. She is a graduate of Calvin College in Michigan. Calvin's an interesting place. It's not exactly, it's not Baylor. It's not the Baylor of the Dutch Reformed. Like Baylor is the most liberal of the Baptist colleges and is constantly getting in trouble with the Baptist administration. Calvin has had a kind of interesting history as a place where faculty has pushed back against, for example, the young earth. And so there's a tension there. She is a graduate of Calvin. There is nothing indicating her particular beliefs on evolution. She has not spoken about it that I could find. I don't know that anyone else has found either. Her husband, on the other hand, while running for Michigan governor a decade ago, suggested that schools should be able to teach intelligent design. It should be a local option. This kick the can down to the local option is something that you will find quite regularly in both Democratic and Republican political candidates. Local control of education, they don't have to deal with a controversial issue if they just say it's the local school district's decision. And that may have been what he believes, although there are other indicators that, quite possibly he is an intelligent design fan. It would not be a big surprise. Mrs. DeVos's main issues, however, are not evolution or climate change education, but school choice, which means the schools choose, but that's another story. Mr. Perry, the probable Secretary of Energy, will not have much to do with evolution education in his formal capacity, but as governor of Texas, he was unconcerned with activities of creation of school board members to promote intelligent design, and even appointed young earth creationist advocate Don McElroy to 2 terms as chairman of the State Board of Education. Dr. Ben Carson, a surgeon, is likely to inexplicably be heading up the Housing and Urban Development Department. He has been quite open about his beliefs in a young earth and special creation. Mr. Pruitt, the Arkansas Attorney General, is nominated to be head of EPA and will not have much direct influence on education policy, of course. He does not accept the views of qualified scientists on climate change, but we do not know his views on evolution. His views on social issues are quite conservative, though, and he believes that it is legal to distribute religious tracts in schools, which may be a warning sign about his First Amendment Establishment Clause position. In 2002, Vice President Mike Pence made a speech in Congress about evolution being a theory in the popular sense of unreliable hunch. In this curious speech, he claims textbooks will have to be rewritten because the discovery of the early hominid fossil Sahelanthropus somehow upsets our understanding of evolution, which he understands as a linear sequence of creatures marching up to modern humans. No, that's really not what human evolution is like, ladies and gentlemen. He also requests that in addition to evolution being taught as a theory, we also teach special creation, since that is what the Founding Fathers believed. He believes that science will prove intelligent design and that it is the only rational explanation. The fact that he is a Catholic actually makes it less likely that he is a young earth creationist, although clearly his beliefs are religiously quite conservative. Atmosphere is important in the development of policy, and this group of people is very unusual in its, shall we say, lack of enthusiasm for the teaching of evolution and apparent disinterest in the Establishment Clause. We do not know the specific views regarding evolution of most of them, but we know that they have conservative views on a number of social issues: abortion, marriage equality, the right to discriminate based on religious views, and so forth, which tend to be positively correlated with belief in creationism. Right now, we don't know, but atmosphere is relevant. A tendency to reject the scientific consensus when it is inconvenient for economic or political reasons, such as with climate change, can also easily bleed over to evolution. I'm kind of, my sort of worst case little daydream is if in the current administration somebody suggests that we need to teach all the evidence or treat evolution as a theory or teach the weaknesses of the weaknesses of evolution as a way to promote critical thinking, these views will actually be listened to in meetings in the cabinet room adjacent to the Oval Office. And that, as with the Santorum Amendment in 2001, policies will be suggested that, even if they're not mandatory, will energize the base to make changes at the state or local level. Now, a third way that the incoming administration can affect the teaching of evolution is more long-term, through the appointment of judges. Now, not just the Supreme Court. Remember that the federal bench and the appeals court judges are also lifetime appointments, and the federal bench and the appeals court are the first lines of defense when it comes to the defense of evolution in the public schools. We have been fortunate that judges from the district level up to the Supremes have understood that teaching the various kinds of creationism is an Establishment Clause violation. It is religious advocacy. That's the cough, excuse me. Religious advocacy, and have struck down all attempts to mandate the teaching of creationism and intelligent design. But remember that the more subtle forms of creationism, like those I mentioned earlier that don't, up the little gray bars up there, that don't specifically single out evolution, and which have an appealing critical thinking component to them, have not yet been tested in court. The appointment of judges sympathetic to these views could radically change the environment for evolution education. Remember that, and I really can't stress this too much, 100% of the evolution and creationism cases that have gone before a court, a district court judge, appeals, or the few ones that have gone to the Supremes, 100% of these cases have gone in favor of evolution. Not 90%, not 95%, not 97%, but 100%. And frankly, if that wall is cracked, remember that there is a minority of Americans who really don't want their children to be taught evolution. They feel very, very strongly about it. They are not a majority of Americans. The majority of Americans don't give a damn one way or the other, actually, truth be told. But a minority that is very motivated to to protect their children against the teaching of evolution from their point of view, they can make some serious gains and make some serious changes in how evolution is taught. Remember the decentralized nature of American education, just in general, for any topic. And if that 100% of all cases of creation and evolution that have gone to support, against the teaching of creationism, if that cracks, it's going to be Katie bar the door. There's going to be lots and lots of pressure on school districts and teachers to bring what everyone in this room would consider non-scientific views into the science classroom. There's no guarantee that this 100% success record is going to be maintained. If one of these more kind of ambiguous sounding critical thinking, we don't even mention the E word, kinds of bills gets submitted in the future and goes before a judge appointed for this person's conservative legal and probably religious views, the result could be quite a bit different. In either case, whether a legal decision or a federal policy that energizes the base of evolutionists, it's not just the National Center for Science Education that's going to have a lot of work to do. All citizens who care about science literacy and church and state separation will need to step up to the plate. I hope that includes you. And now that I have probably depressed at least 90% of you, I do want to thank you for your kind attention to my talk, however grim, and to the organizers of this meeting for inviting me. Thank you.
Repeat the question. We have time for questions. If anyone has a question, a well-posed question that starts with a why or where or how, and not with a one time when I was in school. Here's a question. You can turn down 5. This is really bright. Can you turn down mic 5 there for us? There we go.
I have a question. When did the Federal Department of Education come about? We keep talking about the local education. Where did this organization come from?
I think that was during the Nixon administration, but thank you. Don and I agree, it must be true.
Can we have the house lights? Is that possible? Oh, here's one in the back.
My question starts and ends with why.
Why what?
Why? What is their
Why
motivation?
is there this animosity against evolution?
Yeah.
Okay. If you are a conservative Christian, and I mean by that not politically conservative necessarily, but religiously conservative, they prefer the term conservative Christian. It's some evangelicals, fundamentalists, Church of God, the more biblically literalist wing of Christianity. Your religious beliefs are that the Bible is absolutely true in all respects, and that in fact there had to be a literal flesh and blood Adam and Eve in order for there to be, there had to be a literal flesh and blood Adam and Eve, real human beings who had to sin in order to justify Jesus' death on the cross, which is what gives all of us life eternal in the Revelations. So the entire Bible, from Genesis through Revelations, is all a single piece. You can't, as they put it, pick and choose. So the salvation of their children is dependent upon the children's belief in the truth of the Bible, which is indeed incompatible with our understanding of evolution. Now, in addition to this, they are very concerned because they also believe that the Bible is the only source for morality and ethics and a guidance for how you should lead your life. So they are also very concerned that if their children lose their faith, their children will become bad people. They won't have that moral rudder. So, these are very sincerely held and serious fears that a segment of the Christian community believes bad things will occur if their children learn evolution and their children lose their faith, and they believe that because the way they interpret Genesis is incompatible with evolution. Obviously, that's not the majority Christian view. But because their version of Genesis is incompatible with evolution, therefore you have to pick and choose, and they don't want the teachers persuading the children to give up their faith. So it's a serious issue for them.
Here's one.
Why do you think national standards for education are so much more popular in Europe than they would be here? Shouldn't every child have
I think it's really a historical factor more than anything else. Remember that the United States was a frontier nation. We were settled from the coasts on in, with pioneers going up the river valleys and gradually populating the center of the country. In those, a lot of times there were only territories. There weren't even states. If there were states, the states didn't do anything. They didn't have any money. They couldn't do anything. If you wanted a fire department, you had to invent your own fire department. If you wanted a church, you had to invent your own church. Somebody had to be called. If you wanted a school, you had to set up your own school. So we've had a decentralized education system pretty much from the founding of this country. The European nations are a lot older than we are. They're no longer frontier. Last 200 years have not been a frontier kind of existence for them. So they are much more top-down in terms of the history of their education systems and these days the practice.
Well, I'm wearing one of my 10 Darwin shirts, so I'm a huge fan.
My kind of guy.
Thank you. Just expanding on previous questions, you asked why, and the answer was, religion's contradicting. My question, which, for me, learning about evolution, it makes me think life is so profound because, we're connected to everything, and, they say when our tribes were really small, we had to get along and sort of formed compassion and altruism, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So my question is, besides it just being true, to me that should just trump everything, but my question to you is, what can we do to convince people to sort of accept it or at least be interested in it and really just accept it? Like, what are some positive things instead of, because they automatically go to, oh, it contradicts with my beliefs, but what are some other ways that we can convince people to accept it or get them more interested in the fact of evolution?
Well, remember, it's the American population, like Gaul, is divided into three parts. There are the people who are very conservative Christians. They're highly unlikely to change their views, although it's possible. It's not really likely. It's a substantial group. It's probably, maybe 20 to 25% of the American population. It's not an insubstantial group. Then there's a smaller proportion that have no problem with evolution. This would include people who are non-believers and most of the Christians, if they actually know their theology of their denomination. But most Americans really don't think about evolution, and frankly, most Americans don't really think about religion either. I mean, you know, this for a nation that is as you know, answers the survey research data with such high percentages of belief in God, we don't do much about it. We don't have a terribly high percentage of attendance of church, but you know, we are nominally a nation of theists. Clearly, our best efforts would be directed at that middle group, which need to be better educated about the kind of awesome idea that evolution is. And you know, if you want to use that to develop a worldview about your place in the universe, you can certainly do that. I don't think teachers should be, you know, promoting that from the podium, because that's, I find a free exercise problem with that myself. But in terms of, it is possible to reach some of that, you know, third group of conservative Christians who are pretty set in their ways about evolution being evil. But I, as a non-believer, am not going to have much influence with that community. But friends of mine who are themselves evangelical Christians, who have accepted evolution, have sort of gone through that process and have tweaked their theology sufficiently so that they have some of the same beliefs that you do, that, you know, oh my God, I'm part of this whole huge universe. And from their standpoint as believers, this is all part of a magnificent plan. It just makes God more, you know, more awesome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm interested in evolution getting taught. Yeah, fine. But communication theory tells us that you are most likely to make a change in somebody's views if you establish a rapport with that person, if you establish a trust relationship with that person, so that you can actually exchange views without just posturing. This is why the internet is such a worthless place for changing people's ideas, because you can't possibly establish an eyeball-to-eyeball kind of trust relationship. You're just wasting your time. I'm an old lady, what can I say? But simple message, repeated often from a trusted source. That is the mantra that you should keep in mind if you're going to try to communicate to change anybody's point of view. Simple messages and accurate, you know, we think accuracy is important. Simple messages repeated often from a trusted source. For conservative Christians, it ain't me, babe. Thank you very much.
Eugenie Scott, very nice. Eugenie Scott. All right.